Welcome everyone. My name is Enrico Ronchi, and I'm the, as just mentioned before, I am the coordinator for the, together with Erika Kuligowski of the IAFSS Human Behaviour in Fire permanent group. We are here today to open up this webinar series with the talk on the academic publishing world. And I'm very happy to have as speakers Professor Guillermo Rein, Professor Bart, Merci, Dr. Karen Boyce, along with myself. The reason why we have this pool of speakers is because they are all involved in editing activities for some of the key, I would say the main key fire science related journals in the field. As mentioned to you, this event is the first event of our webinar series. We have a few ongoing activities within the Human Behaviour in Fires group of IAFSS. If you want more information about this, we have here, you have here the link to join that I also put in the chat, but I also put our emails, and you can see we also have a Twitter account and a LinkedIn group that you can join. Everything is, I would say, fairly new, so we started recently, so we're building up activities in this domain within the International Association for Fire Safety Science. You don't need to be a member of IAFSS to be part of this group, but of course it's encouraged. It's encouraged, and it's a good opportunity, maybe if you're not a member, to see the type of activities that we do in this group, and maybe also see for other groups, and then possibly join in. So why are we doing this? We are doing this event because we want to be more clear about how the editorial process works and what type of decisions are taken by editors regarding papers that are submitted for publication, scientific papers. So one of the key motivation of doing this is because we want to make sure that people know how those type of decisions are taken and what are the criteria used by editors of papers in general in fire science, and more specifically today we will talk also about papers in the domain of human behavior in fires. To do this, we have three editors that are very active and I would say involved in some of the key editing activities in our field. The first one is Professor Bart Merci, that is the editor-in-chief, along with Professor Luke Bixby of Fire Safety Journal. Hi Bart, I can see you are online. And then we have Professor Guillermo Rein, that is the editor-in-chief of the Journal Fire Technology. And myself and Erika Kuligowski are actually associate editors in the domain of human behavior in fires for this journal. Then we have Dr. Karen Boyce, that is the guest editor for the Human Behaviour in Fire special issues that are edited in fire materials. Hi, Karen. Hi. And then we will have, after a general introduction about some of the statistics and important information about why papers get rejected in those journals, we will hear more specific about common rejection reasons for human behavior in fire papers. And you will hear some feedback on this from Karen and myself. And then we will have some time at the end for question and answer. So I will kindly ask you in this case to add your questions in the chat, so that I can read them and moderate them, and you can ask pretty much anything related to academic publishing and decisions taken by editors regarding publications. So that's a bit the idea, that we will have a discussion at the end. So, as I mentioned, we are doing this because we want to understand what is the status quo of human behavior in fire papers in three top journals in a fire safety science domain. And also, we want to explain a bit authors the editorial process, and in particular, the editorial decision-making process when we decide what to accept and what to not accept. Because I've seen over the years that there are a lot of misconceptions about who takes the decision, how the process works, and also there are some differences between different journals that we may want to be clear about. In addition, we want to promote transparency in peer review. So we want to be as transparent as possible about how those decisions are taken and what are indeed the factors that lead, for instance, to a rejection reason. And help authors identify weaknesses in their manuscripts, because if you hear now from us, okay, you should not do this when you present your manuscript, hopefully this can be the type of information, or even serve as some sort of a checklist for you to things to double check in your manuscript to increase your chances of publication and decrease the chances of rejection. And in general, we want to promote a supportive environment in academic publishing. So we want to dismantle this myth of whatever is called reviewer too mean comments. We saw a lot of things going on and jokes going on online about people being harsh reviewers, but we want to actually create in the fire safety world a supportive environment in academic publishing, because everyone has an interest in having better papers published and better science published. And in general, we want to promote and appreciate peer review as a constructive process in science. So this is just one slide that I put together to explain a bit what happened to your paper after submission. Generally, at the beginning, there may be a format check by the publisher, not always. Some journals do, some journals do not do it. And then the papers go to the editor-in-chief or one of the editor-in-chief. There is more than one. And the editor-in-chief does a first assessment: is the paper is out of scope, or it is evident that it doesn't meet scientific standards. And in that case, you proceed with the so-called desk rejection. So this paper is not even sent for review, but is desk rejected. Some journals have also associate editors. Some journals, they don't. For instance, Fire Technology has associate editors, as well as Fire Materials. Instead, Fire Safety Journal, I know that it doesn't. So the paper either is sent to associate editors or directly by the editor-in-chief for review. And the associate editors, if there are, they can also decide, since they are generally specialists in that subject, that the paper is not, let's say, good enough already at that stage, and proceed themselves with desk rejection if they think it's good. And or if the editor-in-chief thinks it's there is some potential in the paper, then they're sent for review, and then they go through the review process, and once it gets an acceptable level, they are accepted. Some quick information: the number of reviews and reviewers can vary. On average, we see in our field 2, 3, but they can be 4. It can be more in some cases. Some cases can be less if we have very good reviewers that provide very comprehensive feedback. The viewer feedback is advisory. So this is another thing that is not clear sometimes. The ultimate decision lays with the editors, not with the reviewers. The reviewers provide comments, but then it's the editor that decides. Because we sometimes see comments as editors: oh, the reviewers were overall positive on my manuscript. Why did you reject that? Well, an editor can overturn sometimes decision, or all the way around. Some reviewers may be very negative, but an editor can still trust that the paper has some value and push the paper through another round of review in order to get it to improve. So it's the editor that has the ultimate decision. And this can also be complemented with more reviewers' feedback being asked or obtained, and it can happen also that papers shift around between editors for different reasons. It can happen. So you may find sometimes the new pool of reviewers can be asked to review the paper. And in general, the final decision are always taken by the editor-in-chief, generally also in consultation with the associate editors, depending on the journal, if there are associate editors. So I leave the word now to Bart so that he can give an introduction about Fire Safety Journal and the common rejection reason in the journal that he's editor for.
Thank you very much, Enrico. Thanks for the good introduction as well on the process, which I think was very clear and important to share. And as you mentioned, indeed, I'm actually speaking now also on behalf of Luke Bisbee from the University of Edinburgh. And as you mentioned, but I will repeat, we do not have associate editors with Fire Safety Journal, meaning that essentially Luke and I, as you described, first do a quick screening of any paper that is submitted to Fire Safety Journal to check whether it's sufficiently within the scope of the journal, and then also to have a first check on the overall quality of the paper, including the level of English. I'll come back to that a bit later. As you can see here on this slide, it's actually a fire safety journal is trying to be a journal with a wide scope, but nevertheless, let's say the scope would be added value in the field of fire safety science or engineering. Maybe we can go to the next slide, please. I had a hard time trying to find really how many papers were dedicated to human behavior in fire. So what I did was a search with two papers with the word human in the title, hoping that those would cover most of the submissions in this field. And as you can see here with the numbers, I will not go through all the numbers, and it's a relatively steady fraction of the submissions, and it's a relatively high fraction of the submissions, so approximately 20%. In the boxes that you see at the left-hand side of this slide, you see that we have a relatively strong increase in the number of submissions, and then the acceptance rate is a bit variable from year to year, but I would say that it is around 30%. We have a few years with higher ones, and these are the years where we have the IAFSS symposium proceedings, which have been reviewed before they are then transferred to Fire Safety Journal. Also, maybe worth mentioning is that there is only a relatively small difference between the number of accepted papers and the number of published papers per year. With one exception, perhaps in 2020, and that's because then, again, this refers to the symposium proceedings, which had been planned to be published in 2020, but as we know, the symposium has been postponed until 2021, so those papers have been then published in 2021. Next slide, please. So then the question was asked to list a few of the rejection reasons in Fire Safety Journal. So the top one is that maybe I should say that all these reasons here are not specific for human behavior in fires, and they are really general, but they also apply to the human behavior papers. And so one important aspect is novelty and added value. So if that is insufficiently clear, either assessed by Luke or myself or by the reviewers, then this is a reason to reject the work, and that links also to the positioning of the work within the context of what is already known. So if the paper comes up with a method that has been well established and applies it to a single test case and believe that it's something new, then it's clear that the author is not really aware of state of the art. The second reason is, or a second reason for rejection is that the relevance, either scientifically or the practical significance, is not clear. And so it could be a well-described experiment, for example, but if it's not clear how the experiment itself would add to the knowledge or skills in fire safety science or engineering, then that can also be a reason for reject. An obvious one would be technical flaws in the work that cannot easily be repaired. And these flaws could be at many different positions. It could be in the method used, and that would be, for example, experiments that have not been characterized completely or clearly, or simulations that have not been done with the correct settings. But an important one is also the analysis. So we sometimes find papers where many observations have been made, but no explanation or no interpretation has been made. Well, that could then perhaps be a report with interesting information, but it's not a journal paper, and so it's not a paper for a scientific journal. If it's out of scope, that's also one reason to reject, but also sometimes it's clear that it would fit really much better elsewhere. And to give one example, if the paper is on a risk assessment method, and it's very mathematical and really focusing on the methodology to try and quantify risks, and then the application could be fire related, then still it would fit much better in a more mathematically oriented journal. That's just to give one random example. And then the final one, and that's an important one as well, is the level of English. And it's much acknowledged and appreciated that this is not always easy for non-native English-speaking persons. I am not native English-speaking myself, but it's very important that this screening of the level of English is done before submission, because otherwise the paper will not be sent out for review. It's not comfortable for reviewers to receive a paper which is very hard to read, where you have to guess what the authors are trying to explain. And unfortunately, sometimes even assistance is looked for and still does not lead to a sufficiently high level of English. But please beware of this and pay attention to this aspect. That's all for now, and I'll be happy to participate in any discussion afterwards.
Thanks, Bart. Thanks, Bart. So we can go to the next journal. I see, Guillermo, you're online.
Yeah, can you hear me well?
Yes, all good.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, Erika, and thank you, Erika and Enrico, for organizing this, and good morning, everyone. I think the organization of this event is a fantastic idea, and I cannot be happier about what this new group of human behavior in fire is doing. So I would like to tell you a few things about fire technology. You will see that there are many, many things in common already with what Bart has presented to you with the Journal of Fire Safety. Just to say, fire technology is the oldest journal that we have in fire science. It started to publish in 1965. It is the journal associated to two societies, to the NFPA, to the National Fire Protection Association, and the Society of Fire Protection Engineers. So we are the journal of these two agencies. You can see there a list of the associate editors. The structure, how the journal works is different. Probably the biggest difference that we have with Fire Safety Journal is that the structure is based on one editor-in-chief, and then there is a group of associate editors, and associate editors are experts on the specific topic in case I want to call for them to handle it. We are very fortunate to count with 3 world leaders on the topic of human behavior in fire. We have Steve Wine, we have Erika Kubolowski, and we have Enrico Ronchi. It's a journal that, no matter how you look at left, right, up and down, is in a healthy situation, is attracting good papers, is being read, and it is having an impact in the community. So we are happy for that, and obviously we want more. We think that fire safety engineering and fire science can grow much more, and actually it is growing, and obviously we want fire technology to be part of that growth. Enrico, the next slide, please. So these are the little bit of the metrics, is a little bit of a small front, but just to let you know that we receive about 300 to 400 papers per year in all topics related to fire. Only a fraction of this, I would say, maybe a quarter, or between 15% to 20% to 30% are related to human behavior. We typically accept about a third to maybe 40% of the papers. Or sorry, 1/3 is rejected and the rest is accepted. Sometimes it goes higher, sometimes it goes lower. And we publish per year in the order of 100 to 150 papers per year. It's something that is always, used to be more like 100 per year, but now we are moving more towards 150 per year. Just because the journal is growing and it's attracting more top papers. You can see the countries are very similar to the countries that also publish in Fire Safety Journal and in Fire Materials. Maybe with us, there is an emphasis in countries that used to be less represented. For example, China was not well represented in fire technology. So we have been, for the last few years, having an emphasis on attracting top Chinese papers into the journal. When you look into the percentage of papers that are accepted and published in the regarding to human behavior. It varies from one year to another. If we have a special issue on the topic, obviously that year we have more. And if there's no special issue or there is a conference going somewhere else, and that typically means more papers on that topic appear somewhere else, we have between 10 to 20% of the papers in the journal are on human behavior. Next slide, please. When I was asked by Enrico and Erika to list the 5 top reasons of rejections in pharma technology, I come up with a list that is very similar to the one of Bart, maybe expressed in different words. It is very important to learn from cases that do not work out. It's very important to learn why papers are being rejected, why the research that has been conducted and the time that has been taken to write a paper doesn't end up in being published in a specific journal. We can all learn from this. I just wish that I'm very optimistic in nature that next time that we do this seminar, we do it next year, it should be the reasons why the paper got accepted, and then we can focus on the good examples. So for example, when my students say, how should I write my paper? I always tell them, when look into the journal that you like, or the journals that you like, and look for the award-winning papers, the papers that have been highlighted for different institutions on different reasons, or maybe choice by the editors, and read those and look into how they structure, look how they argue, look how they use the figures, look how they conclude, right? It's not just the method, it's not just the experiment. Writing a paper is more than just doing the experiment. Anyway, top 5 reasons are, and I tried to put this in order of importance, although towards the end it's more difficult. The first one is when we don't see enough scientific rigor. Typically papers that are submitted to pharma technology, they do have some scientific rigor, but there has to be a threshold above which the editors, me and associate editors, say, well, wow, that this is a serious endeavor of science. And we think that the method used is justified or well chosen. We think the decisions that are in the paper are well justified and are convincing. We think that the model is validated. We think the experiment is well done, etc., etc. So it's very important to have scientific rigor. Also, the scientific rigor depends on the previous literature. When we have an absolutely new topic, we cannot ask this topic to have the same scientific rigor as a topic that has been studied for the last 100 years. So the concept of scientific rigor in reality is relative to how much we as a community knew of the case, of the topic at hand before. The second one would be the novelty. Very often we see papers which are doing things that have already been done, and which in reality is not bad that something has been done before. But if it's going to be doing something that has been done before, it has to do it better, and it has to refer to previous work. So if a paper does something that has been done before, doesn't even mention the work that has been done before, and it doesn't do it better, then this paper is going to be a desk rejection as soon as it is identified. The third one, it is that the paper is going or has gone through multiple iterations of review and revision, which is a very important task. I will add something about this. It's a very important task of journals. Is the journals are not the police guarding a castle or the police guarding a treasure. And it's like, oh, yeah, you're not good. No, we actually see journals as a part of the engine of science. So we promote quality and we promote and signal direction of research and of building a community. So the process of reviewing and revising, it is improving papers. It's not just the police to be convinced that this is good enough. This is also a process where the reviewers are actually contributing and helping the authors. And I have to say that this takes a significant amount of resources, but it's one of the most beautiful tasks that a journal can do in a community. So sometimes there is plenty of reviewers, plenty of revisions, and the editors just don't see this is not improving fast enough. This is not going in the right direction. It's taking too many resources. So it's better to stop it now. And that's one of the reasons that it's very dramatic, the reason, because obviously the authors and the reviewers and the editors have all invested into this, but if it's not working, it's just not working. The fourth one is when the work might be of scientific rigor, maybe it's novel, maybe it's not going through many revisions, but actually maybe the authors are not putting their work in the right context of the previous literature. This happens often, I have to say, especially when junior authors are in charge, and maybe the senior authors take more of a backseat of the writing the paper, that there is no enough integration of the work into what existed before. This is something new, and what does it mean in the context of what was done before? In the integration and justification, and being able to build on top of the shoulders of giants is very important. That will be number 4. And number 5 is one that itself is not a reason for rejection, but typically it comes combined with a little bit of 3 and a little bit of 4 and a lot of 5. And 5 is when the paper just doesn't read well. It just doesn't look good. The English maybe is even worse than my English. The abstract doesn't tell me, the conclusions are not convincing, right? When you see that the authors have not written an outstanding paper. And that reason 5 adds to the other reasons that itself can lead to a rejection. For a paper to be rejected only on the grounds of number 5, that the paper is not written well, it has to be a pretty bad case, right? Because if the research is novel, the method is rigorous, there is an interest into this and is well placed into the literature, but it's not well written, we can fix this in the process of reviewing and revising, signaling the authors where they actually need to improve the process. So these are the top 5 reasons that we see in FAIR technology. And before I finish, I want to highlight that this community, the Human Behaviour in FAIR community, is one of the most dynamic communities that we have in FAIR science. And in the Journal of FAIR Technology, you can imagine we are in contact with pretty much every single community that deals with fire of any shape, buildings, industry, forest, small, large, even in space. And this community that is being now integrated and led in the new working group is tremendously modern, is very young. If you look into who you are, you're very young, you're very dynamic, and you are very constructive. Some of the best and the most impressive review processes that I've witnessed are actually in this field. And I think that's very good. It means you have a bright future ahead. And I'm very thankful for Enrico and Erika to organize this. Thank you.
Thanks, Guillermo. Thanks for the feedback and the information about FAIR technology. So the next journal that we will see is FAIR and Materials. And Karen, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Enrico, and thank you, Erika, for inviting me to speak today. FAIR Materials is not just quite as old as FAIR Technology. I think the first publication was in 1976, and I guess it's one that you maybe wouldn't directly associate with Human Behaviour and FAIR papers unless you have been to the Human Behaviour and FAIR symposia over the year. Traditionally, it would have dealt with more on fire properties, materials and construction products, but certainly in the last 20 years, the scope was widened, and you'll see the list of topics that are covered there. But most important, and I guess in this context, is that we do publish Human Behaviour and FAIR papers. I say we, I'm not the editor-in-chief or even an associate editor, but I have been very kindly asked by Steve, because of my involvement with this symposia over the year, to be the handler of all the Human Behaviour and FAIR papers that come into FAIR Materials. And I have been, as Enrico mentioned earlier, the guest editor for the Human Behaviour and FAIR special issues. The journal publishes about 150 papers, I believe, a year, and it has a good current impact factor, which I guess, like other journals, has been growing in recent years. Next slide, please, Enrico. I did a little sort of overview of what are Human Behaviour and FAIR papers in FAIR Materials, and as I've just mentioned, we've had a number of special issues following the Human Behaviour and FAIR symposia, which are listed there, and most recently we had a special issue from Interflam in 2019, obviously with the association with FAIR Materials and Interscience Communication. So we've had 68 papers in special issues over the years, most of those being in the last sort of decade. But we also do, and I think this is important, given what I've just said, is that it may not be a journal that you would naturally associate with Human Behaviour and FAIR papers, but we do publish and we do welcome submissions in that field, very much so. And as I say, I would be dealing with those as handling those as they come in. And we have been, over the last 15, 20 years, been getting about 2 to publish publishing about 2 to 3 per year through that direct process, and I would very much welcome that to continue and encourage you to think about Fire Materials as a journal that you would want to submit to. Our acceptance rate is about 40%. I guess it's quite similar to some of the other journals. For the special issue papers, that would have been higher because many of those would have been chosen or invited. In a sense, some of the early ones might have been invited to submit to Fire Materials. So, but in general, that would be a typical acceptance rate for the journal. Enrico, we can go to the next slide. I did a little analysis of the breakdown of all the different types of papers that we have published in Fire Materials and Human Behaviour field over the years, and you can see there, I guess not surprisingly, that about 40% of those were maybe observational or experiments. That might have been controlled experiments in a lab, or it might have been drills, unannounced evacuations. Again, not surprising, I guess, given the context of our work. Many of the papers were questionnaire, survey type studies, questionnaires, interviews. Some of them were very particular to certain case studies, big fires that would have occurred. And I guess an important point is that many of them, I think 15% at the end, there were mixed methods. And I think that really lends weight to your work if you do have that sort of triangulation in terms of the approaches that you use or the sources of data that you get, because that lends weight and can very often enhance the types of study the study that you are presenting. I can go to the next slide now, Enrico. I think that the common rejection reasons that I have sort of come up with for the Human Behaviour fire papers that I have seen coming into Fire Materials, and I guess also as a reviewer in reviewing papers in the past, they're no different really from what Bart has said and what Guillermo has said in terms of fire technology, because we are looking obviously for certain standards in all our papers. And I would again sort of reiterate the fact that you know, one of the main things is lack of novelty or practical significance of the work. I mean, that's really important. I say practical significance of the work, I guess, and it's not necessarily the case that there has to be immediate practical implications of the work. It could be a conceptual model, for example, on human behaviour that maybe isn't directly going to be applied somewhere, but it does need to be significant in terms of developing our understanding of the field. And the fact that I guess that isn't clear sometimes in papers, I do feel stems from a lack of understanding of what is already known in the field, and that sometimes is apparent from the literature review. And I think Bart maybe mentioned this earlier on, you know, that often what we do see in the literature review is that it does lack breadth and depth, and the paper that's being presented, or the work, the researchers haven't actually understood what is actually published already in the field and what is the state of the art, and therefore how their work fills that gap. Often it's being put forward as something that's novel, but isn't actually novel because they haven't maybe widened their literature to the whole globally. And I do say that because I think that is an important point to make, because often we do find papers being submitted where the literature review is very much focused in the country of origin of the authors or of the work, where the work has been conducted, and it doesn't actually recognise that that work has actually, or similar work has been conducted elsewhere, which in itself is not a problem, because there may be certainly very good reasons to do similar types of work in different contexts or different countries, particularly because there might be cultural differences or other differences in human behaviour that are really important to explore. But I think if it means that the authors don't show that they do recognise the field, and there's no critical comment on the field then, and knowing where their work sits in that, then that certainly can be a reason for rejection, because that also leads in then on into the work that they've done and the novelty of the experimental work and the actual significance of what they produce in the end. And part of that, and I think Enrico will mention this later on in more detail, but sometimes we do see lack of misuse of terminology, and again, that in itself is not an issue, but if it is, if it's one of those things that are building up a picture, there's maybe some lack of understanding of the field or lack of real consideration about what we really do know in the field, then that can lead to issues down the line. We can go to the next slide, I think there, Enrico. The second reason, I guess, and this has been mentioned, of course, as well, as the methodology. And I think one of the first reasons why a paper might be rejected is because there's just very simply incomplete information. I mean, at the very first instance, at a first scan of the paper, if it's very scarce information about, for example, the sample, which is important obviously in our field, the data collection tools that have been used, the procedures that have been adopted, then we start to raise questions, I guess, about that paper. Now, generally, I would tend to if I see something as the person looking at this in the first instance, and I see something of worth in that, like Enrico said, you know, I would send that out to review. But if these things aren't addressed in the review process, then it really does start to raise questions about whether proper consideration had been given to the sample and the tools and the procedures. And we start to question that. I think that in terms of when we do go forward, we do get that information, of course, this is like any paper. I mean, the methods, we have to have the correct methods given the research question that's being asked. And again, unfortunately, I still do see papers coming in where people, authors have used a questionnaire, for example, a very simple questionnaire to explore behavioural response. So they'll just ask questions, you just send out a survey and ask some questions about what would you do if. And I guess in terms of, you know, really understanding human behaviour and the complexity of that, that's not an appropriate method. So choosing an appropriate methodology is really, really important. And of course, that relates back into the research question that we're trying to ask. And then, of course, given that the approach might be appropriate, it's then, you know, thinking about the tools that have been used. Often, again, we see questionnaires or we see interviews where it's not very clear even what the questions asked have been, how they've been asked, how they've been formed. Sometimes the questions might be asked in such a way that's very obvious that there might be misinterpretation of those questions, or there might be bias in terms of the responses, maybe in terms of the fact that the questions aren't, you know, if there's a number of series of different things to choose from, that they haven't been asked randomly, so that could influence that. And again, in and of itself, it's not necessarily an issue, but it's how that's interpreted. So some of these rejection reasons, as Guillermo said, I think, you know, they all compound often to a rejection of a paper. In terms of experiments, I guess one of the things that we see sometimes is that the experiment creator has really little or no relationship to the real world. And I guess we're talking here about the external validity. But again, in and of itself, it's not necessarily a problem. We realize that we can have real valued benefit of controlled experiments. But again, it's in the interpretation of that. Is the recognition of the limitations in the work, and is that being considered when we get to drawing conclusions from the work. Sometimes I've seen papers that have come in where there's been different trials, for example, in an experiment, and very little understanding of the fact that or controlling the fact there may be learning between those multiple trials with the same participants, and that's not taken into account, and there's conclusions drawn about that that just aren't valid given the way that the trial was set up or the experiment was set up. And of course, another main problem, I guess, in our fields often is in terms of the sample. And again, not an issue in and of itself. We know that in our field that it's very hard sometimes to get samples, particularly when we're doing experimental work. There's lots of ethical considerations with respect to having maybe very diverse populations. Certainly if we want older populations and people that have impairments and we want to do work in that area, sometimes that can be hard to get ethical approval for. Sometimes it can be hard to get participants. We do recognise that, but it is really important to recognise that if we do have smaller samples, or we do have samples that aren't maybe representative of the more general population, that we're very careful then in how we interpret that data. And we can go to the next slide, I think, Enrico. And I guess analysis, again, has been mentioned by Bart and Guillermo, and I would certainly reiterate that as a common reason. And again, sometimes it's the fact that there's just lack of detail being provided. For example, being how the data was extracted from videos, how we define parameters, how density was defined, for example, how we measured speed, if that was something that we were looking at. And again, something that maybe can be refined through the review process, but if that's not clarified to our satisfaction, then again that can lead to that paper being rejected. And again, you know, incomplete or superficial analysis, again, not a problem necessarily, that we do sometimes use very simple analysis. But often what I see is that the analysis doesn't really take, and in terms of the way the experiment maybe was set up in the first place, or maybe in terms of the sample, or the questions that were asked to characterize the sample or characterize the participants, that then the analysis is just superficial. It doesn't really help us get deep down into really understanding, you know, the impacts and the implications of the findings. And often again that leads to, as I said, conclusions that are drawn that are unrealistic given the way the experiment was set up, and or a questionnaire, for example, was set up, where the interviews were conducted, the analysis that was done. So these things tend, in my experience, tend to follow through and compound at the end of the day to lead into rejection of the paper. And of course, inconsistencies in analysis, we see that as well. But sometimes that can just arise from a simple mistake that the author has made or the researchers have made in terms of that analysis, and again can be dealt with through review. And as I said, many of these things can be dealt with through that review process, but sometimes we do see an unwillingness of authors to address what are identified as shortcomings, or to an unwillingness to undertake more meaningful analysis that has been suggested by reviewers, and that would really deepen that, make that a much more significant piece of work. And I think that as well ultimately could end to a paper that does go through the review process, being given opportunities and be given suggestions how that could be deepened, and it's not taken up, and that could lead to ultimate rejection. And finally then, and I think I probably said all of these things. We can move on the slide there, Enrico. I guess I've already said all of this together, but you know, we recognize, I think it's really important to say that in human behavior and fire, it's always going to have limitations. I mentioned, you know, we all know we can't go and set a fire in a building and look at how people respond. There's always going to be limitations. There's always going to be ethical considerations. Because we're dealing with human participants, there may always be limitations with respect to the sampling and the involvement of human participants. And so that in and of itself is not necessarily an issue, but it's how researchers interpret what they have done, what they have found. So again, a real main reason for rejection would be drawn conclusions, as the slide says, that are unsubstantiated given the research approach, given the design, given the data collection tools, given the sampling, not recognizing what the limitations of the research actually are, and drawing conclusions that don't have value given what has been done. And part of that, I guess, is generalizing to other groups, onto other contexts that, as I said, aren't substantiated given how the study has been set up in the first instance. So those are some of the reasons, I guess, maybe a little bit more particular in my experience to human behaviour and fire papers, and I'll hand over to Enrico. I'm very happy to get involved in any discussion later on if there's any more detailed questions. Thank you, Enrico.
Thanks, Karen, for this nice overview. And I just bring up then a couple of more thoughts about rejection reasons that occurred in my experience. And since you focused a lot on experimental papers, I decided to focus more on modeling, because both as associate editor for fire technology, as well as I'm an associate editor actually also in safety science, which edits a few papers linked to modeling of evacuation. There I actually edited around under 50 papers in this domain the last 3 years, so quite a lot. And also as reviewers in Fire Materials and Fire Safety Journal, sometimes Bart or Karen have reached out to me. I see those type of papers. So what I generally see as main issues is there are either flawed modeling assumptions, and this is something that Bart, for instance, brought up in general for Fire Safety Journal, but I think this is specifically important when we look at human behavior in fire, because sometimes the modeling itself is a good exercise done by the research that did the work, but they're not modeling reality. They're modeling something else. They're modeling what they think is reality. And this is very much linked to use of terminology, a certain concept that we know from existing literature that are not actually valid in our domain. So when we see papers that attempt to model irrational behavior, that's an oxymoron by itself, because you cannot model rational decision making if you're attempting to model irrational behavior, panic, or use of terminology like stampede, contagion. So really read up about the literature on this. I put a couple of papers, one the main author was Rita Fay, that explained the misconception on the use of the panic word and what is called panic behavior. And another one was research that from Agani and some colleagues that did a very nice overview on the use of different, let's say, words that are used in the field of crowd dynamics that have been, let's say, misused in a few contexts. So what I generally do, I'm very explicit. I go even like with a Control F and check if one of those words is used. And if I spot one of those words, then I go read deeper and say, okay, what are they actually reading? Because, you know, as editors, we don't have time to review ourselves all the papers. So we want to have a general idea about the paper before it's sent for review. So if you're attempting to model in panic, then you are not knowing what you're doing. That's the thing. So be careful about the choice of terminology and the choice of wording that you use, because this is a really red flag for editors in our field. So another thing that sometimes we see is a mere application of an existing evacuation model. So somebody that takes a commercial model or a research model and they apply for case study, for a given case study. In itself, this is not a problem alone, but you need to have a very strong motivation for having this being a research paper. So there should be either a very unique application or something beyond the regular state of the art of applications in the domain of fire safety engineering, because otherwise just applying a model to a case study, that's not research. That's the work that the consultancy they do. That's the type of exercise that we teach to our students in our educational program. So that's not research. Another thing that I see very often happening is incremental modeling. And again, without validation becomes quite critical. So in itself is not a problem to expand the model. So I put here the example of the social force model because I saw many of those papers. But in itself, that's not a problem. But again, you need to have a very good case and a very good argument to have a pure modeling study without a dedicated validation, so without experimental data, in order to be sure that there is an added value in what you're doing. Because just taking an existing model, adding a parameter, making some assumptions that are not strongly substantiated, make your paper very weak. So you have to be very convincing in your assumptions, modeling assumptions, and the value that you're doing in this tuning of an existing modeling framework. I put here the example of the social force model because it's a one very commonly used in our domain, but it can be any other type of modeling approach for evacuation. Another thing that often happen, and this also was brought up before, is lack of specification in the input calibration and their impact. So if you are running an evacuation simulation, you need to make sure to have a proper specification of how you calibrate the input. And omitting information is always a bad idea. So better to be honest and say, okay, I did this calibration based on these data. So I'm doing, let's say, an open simulation rather than a blind calculation, and explain what you have done. But trying to hide things in a modeling study, it's never a good idea, because that's what makes the editors more, let's say, suspicious that you are trying to hide a flaw in your model, and reviewers as well. They can get like, okay, that means that there is no clarity in hearing what they're doing. I cannot understand the results. Probably the results are flawed if something happens that the results is not convincing. So better to not over calibrate an evacuation model, but rather to be transparent on what are the limitations, because there is value in publishing actually results that have some problems and explaining what those problems are and how can this study improve the literature. And the other classic issue is extrapolation beyond the scope of the model. So classic example that I do using a cellular automata model, so a model that is based on simulation with discretization of the space to predict people densities. That won't work, because the assumption that you do of the size of the cell is going to give you the output of the densities. So this is just an example. Or like using models that have been calibrated with data on evacuation for low or medium density that instead are applied for very highly dense situation. that won't work. I put here a paper that is suggested reading that I wrote a couple of years ago together with Nikolai Bode. That is a very good researcher with background in mathematics that explained the problem with statistical model fitting in pedestrian dynamic research. So there is a list of common errors done in papers in pedestrian dynamics. Another issue is the similarity with existing modeling work, and this has been brought up a few times in today, so I don't go too deep on this. And another problem is applying probabilistic models, because we model human behavior, so we don't see deterministic models in our domain, but using a deterministic approach. So we're running a Monte Carlo simulator, a Monte Carlo simulation, and then just presenting one result. That's conceptually completely wrong. And again, this is something that also tell us as editors that you have not really understood the problem. So be very careful when you use a vacation model and you do probabilistic analysis. So that's it from us. So I would like now to open the floor for comments or questions. So I will kindly ask you to write them in the chat, or if there is somebody that wants to speak up, please add them, because we want to also hear from you, from your experiences, and especially for those that felt like, okay, I felt here that it was unfair that my paper was rejected because I felt I did this. And maybe you can present your case briefly, and we can try to see probably why, based on what we discussed, was the case that your paper was rejected, or if you have a success story of a paper that went through the editorial process. Anyone wants to speak or write on the chat? We have over 50 people attending. I can kick off the discussion if we don't have comments. And there is a question: how often do human behavior papers are published outside FAIR journals? That's a good question. As I said, in safety science, I see a lot of papers linked to a vacation, but not so many about fires. This is I would say the 3 journals that we have today are probably the main hubs for human behavior and fire papers. Sometimes it's as I say, simulation papers. You can see them around also in modeling journals or mathematical modeling journals. That's my experience. But I would like to hear from the 3 editors here about one thing that I had that I think it's useful for the community. If you will have to give one strong advice to the authors, especially to junior authors of papers that are trying to submit their papers, they want it published, what would you tell them? So maybe Bart, you can start with this.
Yeah. Thanks, Enrico. Well, I would say that my major advice is to take your time before submitting something, and it kind of connects to what Guillermo also said. Don't think of editors or reviewers as kind of police. We are all trying to serve the community to have efficient advancement of science. And in that sense, I would say, take your time before submitting. Don't take too much time. I would say, don't be scared to submit something, but don't push yourself to try and submit something that has not properly been finished. And it's kind of the elephant in the room. We all know that there is publication pressure, particularly on young PhD students, but don't get carried away by that pressure would be my advice. And maybe it's also partly due to the fact that we haven't had as many conferences as before the pandemic, but I have the impression that some authors seem to be under a lot of pressure to try and have something published. That's not time efficient for anyone involved in the process, and also not for the authors themselves, because then often they will lose time rather than save time. So be sure and look for quality first, and make sure that you're confident about the quality of what you submit. That's the advice that I would give.
Karen or Guillermo, do you want to chip in on this?
I can. Oh, Guillermo, do you want to go next?
No, please, Karen, go ahead.
Okay, I guess what I was going to say, and I suppose I did allude to it during the talk through my slides, was that really take on board the concerns and advice and suggestions that are given by the reviewers. I mean, I think we all, we all don't like sometimes critical comment, but it is, supposed to be constructive comment. Yes, there may be some serious technical flaw that maybe just simply can't be addressed, but very often, we want to see papers published, we want to see good work published, and sometimes it does take that review process to make that paper the best it can be. So I would say, and I myself have had papers in the past where you put it in and you think, well, that's a really good paper, and then the reviewers have come back and actually there were lots of things that you thought had been explained and weren't, and have had needed significant work, but ultimately what we've ended up with is a better paper. So we all want our work to be represented in the best way possible. So that would be my advice, is to take on board the comments of reviewers. Don't see them as something that you have to just have a quick comment, a quick fix and put it back. Really take on board, spend time to revise the paper as best you can, because it's your work that's out there at the end of the day, and it's going to be read hopefully by many, many people. And the better it is, the more contribution it's going to make ultimately down the line. So that's would be my piece of advice.
Guillermo, do you want to comment?
Yeah, total synchrony with Karen and Bart, 100%. To see the review process as a constructive process that actually leads to a better paper. I'm fully aware of the stress and some of the difficulties that going through peer review means, especially the first time or the first times. I'm fully aware of this. I remember my own experience, and I see this with my students on a weekly basis. But just 2 notes on this: reviewers are humans, and we all humans have levels. We are not perfect. We could actually be given subjective views. We might not have read the paper, the reviewers might have not read the paper in detail. They might have misunderstood. So the important thing is what a reviewer says is not the law of science. It's just a view of a person that has dedicated a significant amount of time to your paper. Therefore, engage and embrace that golden opportunity of getting your paper better by having a strange conversation through anonymous peer review online with a person that really wants to know about your work. So engage, but they are humans. They are not robots, and they are not Nobel Prize. Well, sometimes they're Nobel Prizes, but most of the time we're not Nobel Prizes winners. Because as Bart is referring, peer review as a concept is actually changing towards something that I personally feel uncomfortable. We all familiar with journals that are offering no peer review, although they say that they offer peer review. And I worry what could happen to our community, or to your community, which is a subset of our community, and you are younger and you are more modern. What could happen to this community if people start to move away from proper peer review and start to look into almost like a magazine, like whatever you send, you pay them, and they say they peer review it and it gets accepted? What could happen to this community in 20 years or in 10 years if that is the future of publication of science? I worry about that, and I invite you all to think about it.
Thanks, Guillermo, for the thought. Very much sharing your views on this. We have a couple of questions very briefly, because I know some of you have to leave soon. Here we're all very busy people. What advice would you give for people who are struggling with English in their papers? How to arrange proofreading? Anyone wants to comment on this? Bart, Karen, Guillermo?
Yeah, I can say it's sorry, Matt, you were first. Go ahead. It's a very modern issue. It has happened since ever. English is the language of science for historical reasons, some of them good reasons, some of them not very good reasons. It is a fact, and it's not going to change. And if your science is truly scientific universal knowledge, as we all claim it is, it has to be read in English. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And it is a struggle. English is not my native language. I struggle to learn how to write and how to do write papers in English. It is 100% a requirement in this planet. If not, we would have to change planets. So it's non-negotiable. There are services that are trying to help authors to improve. Those services are interesting. They are a nice way of helping you, but that's not the future. The future is to read a lot, to use good examples, to polish our English, to try hard, And we don't have to write like a beautiful paper like some native English speaker that has been writing in English for the last 50 years, but our English has to be sufficient enough that the paper that the paper can be read and understood.
Yeah, maybe to add to this, sometimes it's also a problem even for native English-speaking persons who are just sloppy in grammar sometimes, and it's a matter of I would say also, but let me rephrase that. I mean, the level of language also often mirrors the overall seriousness and overall investment in time that has been put in the work. Not always, and so sometimes you can see that it's very high level research, but it's difficult for the authors to find the correct words. That can often be remedied. What I'm also referring to is more where you see very sloppy language, including titles of subsections or even the title of the paper that has a typo. That's very disturbing. And so if the authors do the effort, then very often you get to the level that you want. It's more a matter of attitude sometimes, I think. Not always, but often it is. And I think it's worth investing time in this. You need to really try to get that right. As Guillermo says, I mean, this is the lingua franca. Whether we like it or not, that's what it will be for the foreseeable future as well.
Just two more things and then we close. There was a comment in the chat, and I promised that we didn't talk about this with Mike that wrote the comment. He asked, it would be nice to have in the next webinar about how to do peer reviewing. That's the topic of our next webinar, and it's on the 30th of November at the same time. And Erica and Peter Lawrence from the University of Greenwich, they will talk about how to do a nice peer review for Human Behaviour in 5 papers. So you have the link here to register, and I will share this soon in the chat and also in social media. And there is one last question, and then I free the speakers because I know they're busy. It was about register reports. So in psychology, for instance, getting more popular, the people before doing experiments, they publish publicly the ideas, or at least their plan about their experiments, get feedback from the community, and then they work on their experiments and papers. Will this be an idea for our field, or do you think it is not really a good fit for the fire science community? We're not there yet doing this type of collaborative work in this domain. Maybe Karen, or you want to share some thoughts?
I think it's an excellent process, but I guess my concern, I don't know how others are feeling, but I think that at the minute it's getting more and more difficult to get reviewers and good review, and I think that we're a relatively small community. That would be just my concern as to how that would actually work in practice, but I'm sure there might be mechanisms to make that work. But I guess, yes, a really great idea that we can get involvement and collaboration, you know, at the very outset to make sure that some of these things that we did talk about earlier on are addressed at an early stage. I guess it's just in terms of maybe that this group could be something that looks at that and how that might be forward. Great idea, but my concerns would be in terms of just getting the buy-in and the commitment across the board to make that work on a regular basis.
Yeah. I mean, it could be some sort of a paired system. So I review your idea, you review mine, and we all gain something like that. But I think we have to wrap up because we are now at over the scheduled time. I put the link in the chat for register for the next webinar event. The structure will be exactly the same as this one. So I really want to thank again the speakers for your contribution, because as you know, I all know that you're all busy people and I really appreciate your time, and I hope that all the community has appreciate you.